This video lecture. A little bit of a history. Chess has been around for as long as just about any other board game, with the earliest versions dating back to 600 AD in Persia and India, believe it or not. And the modern versions of the game that we play today, let's say tournament chess, have been around since roughly the 15th century and was popularized in Europe. The game of chess is played on a 64-square checker board, a board that alternates between light and dark colored squares. You can say white and green, or in many cases white and black, but light and dark is the most common terms used to describe the rotating or alternating colors on a chessboard. There's basic terminology that you need to know in order to be a chess player. This will help you when reading materials or watching video lectures on our site, as well as just the terms you should use to describe the movements of your own pieces. The first one is rank. Rank is a term we use to describe the side-to-side direction in chess, this being the 6th rank, the 4th rank, and here the 2nd rank, so on and so forth. The next term you need to know is file. File is a term we use to describe the up and down directions of a chessboard, with this being the C file, the first one I highlighted being the E file, the G file, the H file, and so on and so forth. The third and final direction that any one piece can move on a chessboard is a diagonal. Diagonal is a term we use to cut across the board like so, with rank and file being the terms we use to describe the straight, up and down, lateral, and longitude directions. Diagonal is a side-to-side cut across direction, with this being the B1 H7 diagonal, the H1 A8 diagonal, the A2 to G8 diagonal, and so on and so forth. You've noticed as I described the basic terminology of rank, file, and diagonal, I was using the letters and numbers you see directly beneath and to the side to the left of your chessboard. These numbers are known as algebraic coordinates, and they're used to write down chess notation or to keep score in a tournament game. These letters and numbers are used to help us keep track of chess notation. Every move has an address, a note that can be recorded. Every square has a location and a name that we use to refer to it, with this square being E6, this square being C4, here we have G2, C7, B2, H5, and so on and so forth. Notice that we always say the letter first, H, and then the number, 5, whenever we're describing a chessboard or move. A couple quick examples of how we would write down a chess move. Here the rook is on C5, and if it moved to C7, we would use a capital R, and then the location that the piece landed on. Currently, this king resides on D3, and if it moved to E4, we would write a capital K, and then write the square E4. For the knight, though knight starts with the letter K, we use N in chess, as the K is already reserved by the Royal Highness. In this case, we would write N to E3, capital N, E3. When it comes to moving the pawn, typically all you need to write is the square the pawn lands on, in this case G5, as you see here. Some players, especially younger players when they first learn the game, like to use a capital P as they use with the other pieces in order to avoid confusion. We would use a capital B for bishop and a capital Q for queen, and so on and so forth. Now that we've learned the basic terminology used to describe the 64-square battlefield that we play the game of kings on, let's meet all the players and learn how a chessboard is set up to its initial starting classical position. We will start first with His Majesty, with the king starting always on the opposite color square of their army, with the white king starting on a dark square and the black king starting on a light square. The position of the kings is always easy to remember when we learn the starting position of the queens, as the queens are the opposite. They must always start on their own color, with the white queen starting on a white square and the black queen starting on a dark square. Continuing to move from the center first toward the edge of the board, let's add the bishops, the protectors of the royal family. Here we see the bishops start on F1 and C1 for white, and F8 and C8 for black. Next, we will add the knights, the ponies, the noble steeds. The knights start directly between the bishops. And the last piece we're going to add, you'll see, is the rooks, the castles, the towers of power. Knights start out for white on G1 and B1, and for black on G8 and B8. And finally, we see the towers of power bringing up the rear, starting on the edge of the board, the rooks being the most powerful pieces directly behind the queen. They start out on H1 and A1 for white, H8 and A8 for black. Finally, we see the pawns, the little guys, complete the setup of a classical chess game. All the pawns for white start out on the 2nd rank. All the pawns for black start on the 7th rank according to algebraic notation. Before we move on to learning how the pieces move, there is one last important piece of chess terminology that everyone needs to know. When the board is set up, it is often referred to as being split into two areas, the king side and the queen side. The king side is everything from the E file over to the H file, essentially the side of the board that the king is closest to. The queen side is everything from the D file to the A file, essentially everything that the queen is closest to. This is important, and as we get into the later portions of this video, you'll notice that when we describe castling, there are options to castle both king side and queen side. Remember this terminology, as it'll help you understand what authors are referring to when they're describing plans and strategies on certain areas of the board. Now that we've learned how to set up a chessboard, and we've met most of the players, let's take a deeper look into how each piece moves, as well as learn the value, or let's say relative value, of each respective chessman. Each chess piece has a given value, and these are to serve as guidelines as you make decisions throughout every game you play. When introducing the pieces, stating their value, and teaching their movements, each coach may have a different strategy. I like to teach with the easiest piece to learn first and move backwards towards the most complex. You may be surprised in which order that is. First, let's start with the rook. Here we see a rook on e4, and we learn that the rook is a powerful piece that moves along the straight lines of a chessboard. The straight lines, we already learned, are the ranks and the files. A rook can move in one direction at one time on a rank or a file. So in this position, the rook has the option to move to any square along the E file and any square along the fourth rank. As long as it is not obstructed by its own army or the enemy army, the rook can move as far as he wants in any one direction on the straight lines of the chessboard, and he is worth 5 points. The bishop is in many respects the polar opposite of the rook. The bishop is not allowed to move along the ranks or the files, ever, and its only legal movement is along the diagonal of the color it currently sits on. In this position, for example, this bishop can move to any square along the B1, H7 diagonal, or any square along the H1, A8 diagonal. A bishop that starts on a certain color, as we learned with the bishop starting on F1 and C1, must stay on that color for the entire game, as it only moves diagonally and will never have an option to move along a straight line to change colors. Quickly, as we state the value of the bishops here as 3 points, we will remind you that you have 2 bishops of each color to start the game. You have 1 bishop on the dark square and 1 bishop on a light square. Both of these pieces will be stuck to that color square for the entire remainder of a chess game. The next and perhaps easiest piece to understand is Her Royal Highness herself, the Queen, the First Lady of Chess. Essentially, the Queen is a rook and bishop combined. She moves along the files, the ranks, the diagonals, and as long as she is not obstructed by any one of her own pieces or one of the enemies, her scope extends to the far corners of the chessboard on almost any square that she stands on. The queen is worth 9 points, essentially the cumulative sum of a rook and bishop as 8 points, plus an extra 1, as the queen has the ability, when she moves like a rook, to switch from a light squared bishop to a dark squared bishop. So rather than being worth only 8, the queen is essentially worth 9, which is again 1 more point higher than the cumulative sum of the rook and the bishop. She's the most powerful piece, though not the most valuable piece, as we'll learn about the king right now. The king, though limited in his mobility, is the most valuable piece because he does not even have a value. Can be said that the king is worth infinity, the king is worth the entire chessboard. Some have even said the king is worth more than your mother. Totally joking, just relax. In any case, the king can only move in one square at a time, but in any one direction he chooses. Much like a queen, however, limited by only 1 square at a time. The king could move from this position to D5, to E5, to F5, and so on and so forth. The king is the most valuable piece because you are unable to trade him. It is not an option to trade him for any other piece. A king starts the game and is one of the only pieces guaranteed to be on the board when the game is finished. The king cannot be traded, but he can only be trapped. That is known as checkmate, which we'll get to at the end of this video, as the goal of every chess game you play. So again, your king is the most valuable piece you own. You can list him as valuable as the 64 square battlefield that you play on, and he moves it 1 square at a time in any one direction. The final 2 pieces to learn are perhaps the most tricky. The knight is the one piece that does not fall under the category of moving either straight on a rank, file, or diagonal, as every other piece does. The knight has an awkward movement that is often referred to as a capital L or boot shape. A knight in the center of the board is best placed because it has access to the entire area of the board. When the knight moves, you can often draw 2 lines that would look much like a boot or a capital L. So often that term is used when teaching children how to play the game, as the knight can be a tricky piece to master at first. As you see, the knight does not fall under the category of maintaining a straight line when it moves. its sort of awkward movement makes it even more important than the other pieces that it maintains the center. As you can see, while a knight on e4 controlled up to 8 squares, a knight on the corner of the board or on the edge of the board would only control up to 2. When capturing, a knight only captures a piece that is on the landing square, its final destination square. Though a knight, because of its awkward movement, has the ability to hop over both his own army and the enemy army, you do not take pieces you hop over. This is often confused for checkers. A knight, for example, capturing this bishop on c5, would capture that bishop because the bishop resided on its final landing square. However, even though the knight technically crossed over the path of the pawn on c4 when moving to this square, the pawn on c4 is not captured. Remember that. Here's another example. We capture the pawn on d2, and though we sort of technically cross this e2 square with the awkward movement of the knight, we do not take squares or pieces that we hop over, only pieces that happen to reside on the final destination square for the knight. The knight may also have the option of taking the piece on f6 here. The other piece that falls under the highly tricky category is the pawn. Pawns can move only in one direction, only forward, all the time. The most loyal servants in your army. They only look forward to attacking the enemy. Pawns move one square at a time, and that's it. They capture differently than they move, which we'll talk about in a second. But the one exception for a pawn to move 2 squares is on the first move. When the pawn still resides along the 2nd rank, or in black's case, the 7th rank, the pawn has the option, though not the obligation, to move 2 squares. Many people will start out a chess game moving their pawns 2 squares, as it's a quicker way to advance their army and develop. You can see more information on how to start a chess game in the Everything You Need to Know, the opening installment of this video series. But back to the pawns. Pawns move 1 square at a time, only forward all the time, with again the option to move 2, though not the obligation, on the first move. Pawns are the only piece that capture differently than they move. As we see here, if both black pawns started by moving 2 squares, they would actually be stuck, with neither side having the option to move until either A, other pieces came along to help, or B, another piece came along to the side of it, the diagonal, allowing for a capture. A pawn only captures 1 square at a time just as it moves, but it only captures diagonally. You cannot hop over another pawn that is in front of you. This is not checkers. And you can only capture if a piece resides on the immediate square to the left or right of your pawn, the short diagonal. An example of pawn capture would be this, with the white pawn on e4 having the option to take both the knight on d5 as well as the rook on f5, however not his counterpart on e5. Meanwhile, the black pawn has the option to take the pawn on d4 diagonally, but not the option to take the pawn directly in front of him. Pawns only capture diagonally, never forward, and they are the only piece that captures differently than they move. Finally, the most special thing a pawn can do, perhaps making up for the fact that it's only worth 1 point in value when compared to the other pieces, is to promote itself. A pawn promotion occurs when it reaches the other side of the board, in white's case, a pawn reaching the 8th rank. Here we see that the pawn has the ability to promote itself to either a queen, rook, bishop, or knight. You see that the only 2 pieces unavailable for promotion are the king, as there's only 1 king, there can only be 1 leader, and remaining a pawn itself. You'll notice that black also has the same option if he perhaps has a pawn that reaches the 1st rank. In this case, black has the option to choose between a queen, rook, bishop, or knight, just as white did. Most often, you'll see a pawn promotion occur with one side choosing a queen. However, there are cases of under promotion where you may choose to promote to a rook, knight, or bishop. Now that we've met everybody, we know how to set up a chessboard, we understand the basic way to read a chessboard using the algebraic coordinates we discussed, and we even know the basic terminology of how to describe the movement of our pieces. It's time to learn the goal of a chess game. That is, to checkmate the enemy king. To follow here will be a few different examples of checkmate, and first we must describe check. Check is any position where the king is under attack. This case being an illegal position, as both the white and black king are under fire. This would never be possible in a real game, and is only being used here to highlight a check on both kings. With the rook moving straight would have the ability to capture the black king, and the bishop would have the ability to capture the white king. A king capture is never possible, as whenever a king is in check, he must find safety before all else. It is against the rules to make any other move if the king is in check. We use check as a tool to eventually trap the king and deliver checkmate. The first example of checkmate we'll see is here. One of the most straightforward and simple examples of checkmate, a support mate. The queen is delivering a check to the enemy king. In this way, the black king has no safe square. Moving to f8 would remain in check. Moving to h8 would remain in check. Moving to f7 would remain in check. And moving to h7 would remain in check. Black has no escape square and cannot capture the queen on g7 because she finds herself protected or supported, hence the term support mate, by her own king. Here we see another checkmate resulting in the climax of a two-bishop technique. Here we have the dark squared bishop on e5 attacking the king. This king cannot find safety on h7 or g8, h7 due to the bishop on e4, and g8 due to the king on f7. The black king is in check, he is trapped, and has no escape route. The game is over. Though we could go on for a long time showing you examples of check and checkmate and examples that are close but not quite check or checkmate, to summarize, here are the 3 points. When a king is in check, he must either 1. Be able to find safety himself by moving to a safe and uncontrolled square by the enemy. 2. Be able to block the checking piece by interposing with another piece from his own army. Or 3. Be able to capture the attacking piece. Capture the checker, as they say. The piece that is checking the king must be removed, blocked, or the king must find safety. When neither one of those 3 things is possible, a normal check has just become checkmate, and this is the goal of every chess game you play. Before we move on from checkmate, one thing we must clarify, especially for players first learning the rules, is the difference between checkmate and stalemate. Checkmate, as you learn, is when the king is trapped, he has no safe squares, and nobody from his army can help him. Stalemate is when the king is trapped, he has no safe squares. The difference is he is not under attack. In checkmate, in the position we had earlier, the black bishop, the dark squared bishop, stood on e5 and was delivering the final blow to the king. In this case, with black to move, the king is still trapped, cannot find a safe square, however, he is not under fire. In this case, the result would change from a win for white, which is what the result would be after checkmate, to a draw, a half a point. This is slightly confusing for players who first learn the game, as chess is one of the only games that has an option result as a tie. Most regular sports you're familiar with would move to sudden death or overtime of some nature. However, chess does have the option of a tie, and stalemate, as you see here, is the example of a tie. You've now learned everything that you need to know in order to start playing chess. Congratulations. The basic rules and terminology used to describe a chessboard, as well as how to set up the board and the goal of the game, are all you really need to know in order to start playing and enjoying this wonderful game. However, in order to have truly completed your mission of knowing all the rules and the ins and outs of a chess game, we must show you about the 2 secret moves or special moves in chess. The first one has to do with the pawns. In this case, we talk about en passant, French for in passing. En passant was a rule invented somewhere around the 14th century, which was used as a counter rule when they first gave pawns the ability to move twice. If white has established a pawn on the 5th rank, and only when white has established a pawn on the 5th rank, if a black enemy pawn, in this case either the h or f pawn, tries to move by it in 2 moves, we see that in this way, white has the option, though again not the obligation, to capture this pawn as if it has moved only 1. You are capturing this pawn in passing. As the pawn passes you, you have the right to capture it as if it has moved 1. Again, this rule makes sense when you understand that it was invented as a way to give another option once they allowed pawns to begin moving 2 moves on the first move, which was not always the option. So in this way, once again, you see that if a pawn tried to move by you in 2 squares in 1 move, you would have the option to capture it as if it has moved 1. Noted should be that if the pawn moved 1 square and you neglected capture of the pawn by making another move, then the pawn moved a 2nd square, you no longer have the right to capture this pawn en passant, or in passing, as you had the option to capture it a move before, and you declined to do so. So again, the definition of en passant is that when a pawn moves 2 squares by you from his starting position, so in white's case, it only works if you have a pawn established on the 5th rank, you have the option to capture it as if it has moved only 1, though again, not the obligation. If a pawn advances and you neglect capture of this pawn, and then the pawn advances further, neglecting to capture you, when he does so, you no longer have the right to en passant, as you had your opportunity to capture this pawn and neglected to do so. En passant is a tricky and advanced rule, and is something that many players don't learn until they've played perhaps even up to 100 chess games. The final special move you need to know is the only move in chess where you have the right and ability to move 2 pieces at once. After a natural set of developing moves is played here, white has the ability to castle. That is, to move the king 2 squares and the rook next to it. And this way the king is putting himself on the king's side and out of the way of the center. And in doing so, he also brings the rook quickly into the game. And we'll learn in the opening portion of this video series why it's good to castle and why bringing your pieces into the center of the board is the best idea you can do. In this situation, again, it is the only option, the only time when you have the ability to move two pieces at once. The king castles, and the rook immediately follows it by landing himself on the square directly to the left of the king. Noted should be that you also have the ability to castle queenside. The system is the same. The king moves two squares, and the rook lands himself on the square directly to the right of the king in this case. Again, we see that the king moves two squares, and the rook will automatically find himself on the right side of the king. Castling is only possible when you have not moved the king or the rook from their starting positions. Remember that. Okay, that's it. Congratulations. You now know everything that you need to know in order to start playing the wonderful game of chess. We hope you enjoyed this video, and we hope that it can serve as the first step on your road to chess mastery.